go ahead and get started for the sake of making sure we respect everyone's time. And so today's presentation is supported by our LBW Training and Technical Assistance Award, and we will be focusing on compounding victimizations that those impacted by forced marriage face. We will begin with a brief overview of forced marriage, dive a little bit deeper into the intersections, which is, I think, the part that us service providers from various programs find, most interesting and at times most helpful in thinking about how to provide services. And then we'll just move forward a bit more, thinking about how these sort of issues manifest or can be found in specific, maybe like populations, such as, the work we do with minors, refugee, populations, some immigrant populations, as well as ending with some information on screening and responding. I called out some names in the intros. Those where we have some wonderful partners, experts on the line as well. And so I would encourage all of you to please utilize the chat and share, your own, expertise. That is also very welcome. And so for those of you who may not know about the Forced Marriage Initiative, we are a program that is housed by the Tahiri Justice Center. We have been around for 12 years now, and to date, we have served over 1,000 individuals and trained over 4,000 service providers, folks from various backgrounds, folks who are, coming to us because they have faced a forced marriage, and many individuals who have reached out to our program for direct service support in that prevention moment of knowing that there is a marriage that is planned and needing support and services, which is what Brianna does day in and day out with our program. What is bringing us here today is the support of the Office of Violence Against Women with our Training and Technical Assistance Project, which is funded to really enhance or enable the victim services community to understand how forced marriage is potentially connected to domestic violence, stalking, human trafficking, dating violence, and sexual assault. And so that all stems from the 2022 reauthorization of VAWA, of the Violence Against Women Act, which for the first time defined forced marriage as a type of abuse that does connect with other forms of violence against women. And so I'm very happy to have you here with us, and also equally happy to share that if you are hoping or looking for or wanting training and technical assistance for your own organization, if you would like some support in receiving, our guidance as it relates to your intake and assessment protocols, right? And thinking about how to utilize the questions or information or best practices that we may go over here today, and how to utilize those in your own intake, your own assessment, your own screening processes. That we are here. That is what the training and technical assistance is funded to do, as well as we are always happy to be of support in connecting folks to partners, many of you who are on the call today, connecting folks to maybe culturally appropriate trainees or service providers, depending on what your organization is looking for. And so I see that we have a hand up, but I'm going to go ahead and move us ahead and leave questions to the end. We'll love for Dr. Amin to introduce themselves and introduce her organization.
Thank you, Helids, and thank you everyone who have joined today for this important discussion. As Helids just said, that the VAWA reauthorization has named, the forced marriages, and hence I'm here, being a partner organization that works with DV and SS survivors in Houston. We have been here for since 1996. Daya is a Sanskrit word and not an acronym, and it means compassion. And in 2024, we have helped survivors in 14 languages. So language is not the only thing, but to understand the culture, and that is why we are here. We are mindful that each survivor's journey into empowerment is different, and we meet them at the point that they are at. And we take the first helpline very seriously, because that can be the first and the last one. And we also have the direct services for counseling with licensed counselors. We have case management, the holistic services that we do with the housing program, legal advocacy. And we also help immigrant clients with family law and immigration through our legal advocacy. We are, also very prominent in doing our prevention work with Tahiri and other organizations. Like in the policy level, we like the enhancing the age of marriage. In Texas, we saw a legislation in 2017 raising the age limit. We also do other outreaches of going out and talking to the community about being in the movement to end domestic violence. Telits.
Thank you so much, Dr. Amin. That's really helpful. I know we'll talk a bit more about DIA screening process and the questions related to forced marriage as we get closer to that section. So appreciate your partnership and being here with us and all the work you've done in Texas on this issue. And so I know this is not an introduction type of training or a one-on-one, but I find it really helpful to go through some uh, grounding definitions in what we mean when we say forced marriage and the approach that we take when it comes to working with those who are impacted and not training, in the past. And so if you have worked with a survivor or someone impacted by forced marriage, would love to know. Would love for you to utilize the chat and let us know if your organization does have a definition when it comes to forced marriage. It's wonderful also to know. That helps us to better understand, the field and offer, more enhanced training and technical assistance and connections with folks. But at Tahare, when we are talking about a forced marriage, what we mean is a marriage where one or both people do not or they cannot consent to the marriage. And typically, this means that there are elements of force, elements of fraud, or coercion. At Tahare, we do not equate a forced marriage with an arranged marriage. We understand that those impacted survivors, those at risk, may utilize the term arranged marriage, or they may use other language as they're describing their situation. But we recognize that it is really important to differentiate between a forced marriage and an arranged marriage process. A true arranged marriage process is one where families may take the lead, and that ultimate choice to marry does remain with the individual. And choice here is about the entire process of marriage. It's not just about the person they may be introduced to, it's even about the idea of marriage altogether. It is about the timing of marriage, right? It's being able to provide your opinions, your concerns, to share those freely without fear of negative consequences to you, without fear of negative consequences to other loved ones. And so it is at the point where folks, may find themselves or believe they are in the arranged marriage process, but then they're not able to share their wishes freely, or they have fears of any sort of repercussions, or perhaps they're told, the time has come, and yes, you were told that you could go to college, but you're in high school, and we as your family believe what's best is for this to happen now, right? And so again, thinking about the timing, the person, the idea of marriage all together, and being able to freely express wishes is truly key. That perception of risk is incredibly important, especially in that prevention moment when we're potentially being contacted by individuals at risk who know the marriage is going to happen. Perhaps it has not happened yet. And so, are you equipped to provide services to that person? Are you able to provide them an adequate resource? Are you able to house them if you are a shelter services provider, if that domestic violence has not happened yet, right? And so we'll talk a bit more about the forms of abuse that are connected to forced marriage. This graphic that I'm utilizing to discuss the differences, or the continuum, I should say, of what potentially an arranged marriage could, or an arranged marriage process could be lead to, forced marriage. It's a graphic that was provided by BDS3, a survivor who was at Harvard at the time. They created this continuum, and they worked with Dirakshan Raja, who was at the Urban Institute at the time. I think it is a wonderful image. I'll flag that it is not perfect. Folks don't just go from stage 1 to 2 to 3, right? That's not typically how victimization or abuse works, right? Someone could very well find themselves in stage 1, and very quickly, because of the family level triggers, whatever that may be for that specific family, find themselves, in a process. But again, not every arranged marriage is a forced marriage, and I think it's really important to note that. And not every survivor or every person impacted by forced marriage utilizes the arranged marriage language, right? Every survivor, every person impacted by violence against women, by forced marriage, has the right to name their situation for themselves. These are terms I like to say, like advocate language. That's helpful for us to note as we're asking questions, as we're screening, as we're trying to, grapple with, what is the situation? How do we best offer support? But again, folks have a right to name the situation, for themselves in the way that makes sense for them, for their family, for their community. Just to emphasize, when it comes to consent, right? It should be yes about the time, the person, the idea, and again, being able to freely express wishes, which is why understanding the perception of risk is really important. Often when we are doing screening and intake, we're asking about, the danger assessment question, right? What has happened, right? What forms, how have you been harmed? What weapon has been used? Uh, some providers do not ask about that perception of risk, right? What do you think will happen if you share that you don't want to go through with this? What do you think will happen if you, don't go home today, or if you do go home today, right? That's really important, and it helps to open the communication. When we're thinking about lack of consent, some of the points that we tend to highlight are, again, individuals being subject to forced fraud or coercion. Often we're talking about this happening from family members, parents in particular. And I'm saying parents, and that I don't want you to automatically think that I'm talking about, minor children when I say parents or children, right? Parents utilize, their proximity to their children, whether they are adults or not, and utilize that, power that they have over, being the one in charge of finances, maybe vehicles, you name it, right? And and telling their children, whether they're adults or not, that if they don't go through with the marriage, they're going to lose financial support. They're not going to be allowed in the family home. And so that's something that, again, goes back to that perception of risk and fears that someone may have of like what they're going to lose. What is that emotional coercion? What is it that they're being told to get them to comply that is still taking a heavy toll on their ability to make a decision, if they even feel that they can make a decision for themselves. We have also seen individuals who do have dating partners. So in thinking of dating violence, whether, if those partners are, partners that they're dating secretly, right? Because maybe their family does not allow dating, or for whatever other reasons, we have seen dating partners utilize that information that they may know of their partner to then pressure them to remain in that relationship, to pressure them to move forward with marriage, and even to the point of utilizing pictures or threaten to utilize explicit pictures if they do not agree to marry, and that they're going to show the family and ruin their reputation, which will then ruin their family's reputation, and so on, right? So we see how dating violence can also be connected to, forced marriage. When folks are younger than the legal age to marry, of course, they are losing a great deal of power. And we'll talk a bit more about folks who are younger than the legal age to marry. But even if you do not work with minors, it is very important to note if you are perhaps working with an adult who is someone who was a survivor or impacted in their childhood, because that is trauma that is likely not being asked about, and a lot of support that is needed to truly provide that person with adequate support given the history of abuse that they have experienced. One aspect that we also see in our work when it comes to that piece on being able to provide consent or the forced fraud or coercion, and of course, this is not to say that every person who may face some sort of incapacity or disability is at risk, but it is a population that perhaps is could be vulnerable, given that some do have other adults or other individuals who hold power over their lives, who have perhaps, a power of attorney, who maybe are the decision makers for their life, who are the ones that are allowed to sign documentations for them, and things of that sort, right? And so we've seen individuals who have intellectual disabilities who are finding themselves married, but they did not, sign documentation, or they signed documentation they had no idea about. And we've seen or heard from individuals impacted that they felt the person who was their, guardian, or who had that power of attorney, wanted to just take the burden, right, in quotes, off themselves, and use marriage as a way of essentially getting rid of them, getting rid of that pressure, right? And so it is important to understand that the way that this type of abuse can appear and impact individuals of various uh, identities. And so I'd love to talk a bit more about, coercive tactics for those of you who are, seasoned, advocates. And again, I can see folks are using the chat. I strongly encourage you to chime in, especially, I know there are some, survivors on the line, and lots of experts, partner experts. So feel free to share from your own experiences and working with folks. But these coercive tactics are ones that we often have seen in the cases that we have supported or work on, I should say. And these are not, I would say, very different than what a typical victim advocate or case manager may be working with. But sometimes they can be, I think the piece that connects to forced marriage may be a bit unique in that, for example, when we're thinking about the emotional blackmail, often when we're talking about emotional abuse, we may not necessarily think about emotional blackmail as a maybe like a severe form of abuse. And in the cases related to forced marriage, we're seeing that as a really big part of the experience that the person impacted is facing. We're seeing the toll or hearing how upset they are and or the helplessness that folks may feel and feeling that they are wanting the abuse to stop or the future abuse to stop or the current manipulation or coercion to stop, but not necessarily finding ways to get the abuse to stop, for the marriage to be halted without losing some sort of connection to their family or fearing for their own siblings or fearing that it is their responsibility. And if they don't do this, then it's my younger sibling will have to marry, right? And so that I think is a bit different than the ways that we typically think about emotional abuse. And for the cases that we've supported, and I'm sure my colleagues will say it takes a lot of emotional safety planning as well, helping folks to understand that, why or to share with us why is it that they've reached out for support and services, right? What will keep them safe, and really having a lot of conversations and building some rapport so that folks do feel comfortable and understanding that support for them may not look the same as what we're used to. It may not be that they want to leave their homes. It may be that no, they don't want the marriage to go through, but they still very much want to be at home. And so how do we navigate the complexities of someone, still living at home with folks who are abusive, or potentially abusive. And so another piece related to emotional blackmail that we have seen in this work relates to the intergenerational trauma. Often we have heard from survivors and even again our colleagues, some of you who are on this call, that we're working with individuals who, they themselves are at risk, but they recognize that their mother and maybe even grandmother before them were victims of forced marriage, and there is that intergenerational trauma. And there at times are untended mental health of the main abuser or abusers that comes up, and utilizing, threats of self-harm to coerce the victim, which again is incredibly difficult for folks to feel that they are the reason their father, their mother, their grandmother, their aunt is, unwell or hurting themselves, right? It is a big emotional and mental uh, form of manipulation that is occurring. And so again, most of these are, I'm sure, are dynamics that you all have seen in the work that you do, including decision paralysis, which we know that if it's, survivor, it may take someone, 7 to 8 times to, fully leave I'm going to put in quotes, a typical domestic violence, relationship, right? There is that, like, what do I do? That decision paralysis moment. That's also a symptom of trauma, right? And we see that often happening in the cases that we work with, because again, folks may not want to leave or go through the typical systems that we have in place. Shelter may not be what's best for them. And so how do we still offer support? And even when we do have a plan, folks may change their mind, and that's okay. They're entitled to change their mind. We would not tell a domestic violence survivor they could not reach back out for services or go back to shelter. And we would not do that either for someone who is facing a forced marriage. And so as I move forward to really get us in thinking about, the connections with forced marriage and other forms of violence. And I'll thank my colleague, Shauna, who worked on this graphic for us. I think by now, all of you know that forced marriage is a form of violence against women on its own, right? It may be a crime depending on the state that you're in. There could be some greater avenues for support. For example, in Texas, there is a protection order specific for children who are facing being forced or coerced into marriage. But you may be living somewhere where, forced marriage is not part of the statute whatsoever. That doesn't change the fact that it is a form of abuse on its own. What we do know is that more often than not, forced marriage is never happening on its own. It is happening hand in hand with other forms of violence, potentially crimes that are impacting that person. And so, likely, someone who is being forced to marry, they have experienced abuse, some sort of force, some sort of fraud or coercion prior to the marriage, right? Like as a way of getting them to comply, right? There are things that families do, right? As I mentioned with the coercive tactics, right? So there could have been some sort of family violence that has occurred. I mentioned earlier, an example of dating violence that could occur, right? Things that folks do to get someone to actually comply. Then we have the marriage itself, which often we're not seeing as abuse. But again, we're talking about a situation where someone is entering a relationship that implies a very great deal of power imbalance, right? And so the marriage does have to be seen and hopefully screened if we're thinking about our intake and assessment processes, right? Questions that we may ask about how folks' marriage, came to be, right? Well, how was that onset of the marriage, so that we can understand the complex history that someone may have to that abusive partner and or to family. Again, the marriage itself, that implies a great deal of power imbalance where someone is entering a relationship that they do not want, and that other partner may know or they may not know. But again, they still would hold a lot of power in that relationship, in that household. I'll talk briefly about stalking. If you are a service provider working with individuals impacted by stalking, uh, we already know how difficult it is to prove stalking, all the forms and all the data collection and things that we have to inform those impacted about. What I'll say as it relates to forced marriage is that what we see in cases of forced marriage is that the family utilizes or tends to utilize that close proximity to the individual at risk to then report back, right? So utilizing the natural proximity to that person, which may not look like stalking, but if you really think about it, you're reporting back, right? The person who is maybe utilizing or making it seem that it's for your safety, and perhaps they think it is for their safety, but it's your sibling who is at your school who is reporting back that the guidance counselor is talking to you, or that you were talking to, someone at school that you shouldn't be. It is, your coworkers, because you're only allowed to work in your family store, and so they're reporting back to your uncle, your mother, what they're seeing, right? And so it is really important when you're talking with someone who is facing a forced marriage, when you're asking about perception of risk, and you're assessing for safety, that you are also utilizing some of those tools that relate to stalking so that you can support that individual to truly understand all of these dynamics and potentially be able to lean into resources that may be available for those who are facing, stalking. And so, as I've mentioned before, forced marriage is never happening on its own. There are loads of abuse, violence, potentially crimes that are happening hand on hand, right? We mentioned the marriage itself, right? What happens before a marriage, but also what can happen after a marriage, right? When it comes to rape and sexual assault, we know that forced marriage is not just a consequence of being forced to marry, right? Likely, if you're being forced to marry, then the expectations of intimacy within that relationship are potentially will lead to rape and sexual assault if that's a relationship you never wanted to be in the first place, and you don't see the ability or have the ability um, to express your wishes or even know that you have a right to say no. You may feel that you have no right or consent over your own body. When it comes to domestic and family violence, I would say that typically when someone has already been forced to marry and they're reaching out to domestic or family violence providers, they tend to be able to access services because they follow, that same protocol of, that partner is being abusive to them. What we are unfortunately not seeing often is folks asking about the onset of marriage so that they discover that it was a marriage that, yes, is abusive, but also was forced from the very beginning, right? And so that's what we are noting as we are, speaking to other service providers, as we're speaking to, those impacted across the nation, is that folks are not asking beyond just getting the information on, on if they're married or not. We're not asking more about the onset of marriage. And unfortunately, when it comes to domestic and family violence service providers, when someone is making contact, maybe your hotline or your organization, and they have not been forced to marry yet, we have seen some providers deny services, perhaps because their organization has a policy that they are only supporting individuals who are at risk or going through intimate partner violence. And someone who is calling in that prevention moment may not have an intimate partner. They may say, I know this is going to happen to me. I fear this is going to happen. I fear that I'm going to be taken to, another state, or my family's planning this vacation. And I know they're talking about marriage. And I know what happened to my sister or my cousin. And I don't want this to happen to me. And we're seeing that without adequate advocacy or having another, service provider on the line to explain these intersections, that folks are still being, turned away, which is what brings me back to that point on asking is key, and having intake and assessment protocols that are asking about the onset of marriage is really important, because it is a unique moment of prevention to be able to support someone before that forced marriage has taken place, that future domestic violence, that future sexual assault occurs. And so it really does take all of us asking the right questions, asking from the very beginning. We don't have to know everything, but we can hopefully offer a non-judgmental point of view and ask, because if we're not asking, what we're actually doing is missing a big piece of that person's trauma history, of what they have experienced. And um, it's it leads us to not truly providing the holistic services or trauma-informed services that I know we all want to provide. And so I'm going to pause now and pass it to my colleague, Dr. Nusrat Amin, to share a bit more about how we bridge maybe the cultural divide when we're um, working with folks. Nusrat, I'll pass it to you.
Thank you, Alex. So we have been hearing all this while, how the intersectionality of forced marriage and the domestic violence, sexual assault, stalking, and all that, happens while you can be also in the IV, interpersonal violence. And if you look at this wheel, it is similar to that of the Duluth power of wheel. If you all know about that, the ones you don't know about it is that it's all domestic violence is all about power and control, where one person loses the decision-making power due to the control of the other. And if you look at this wheel, we have tried at Daya to also incorporate the cultural components that the survivors of color face on top of the usual power and control, like the financial, the isolation. We see a lot of others, as you can see, language, lack of trust, in-law abuse, transnational abandonment, religious abuse, and immigration. These are the ones that we usually see, and which happens to our, the clients that we work with. Of course, many of our clients who we work with are first-generation immigrants, and they are dependent on the abusers' immigration, and perpetrators often exploit that as a tactic of abuse, maintaining their power and control by reinforcing the fears of deportation. Like many DIA clients say to us that if I report, if I call 911 and I'm depending on my spouse's visa, I will be deported, but my child who is born here will have to leave. I'll have to leave my child here. So that's an incredibly difficult, challenging situation that they are at, right? And where this power and control works. And aggregated study results indicate that immigrant survivors suffer more and severe abuse and more often, and that 75% of undocumented women in one survey said that their spouses had never filed immigration papers, and abusers who eventually filed petitions for the immigrant spouses waited almost for 4 years or more, and they and 65% of all these victim survivors have said that abusers have threatened deportation. So, of course, there will be a lack of trust in the immigrant population who may come here on a valid visa, but then lose their immigration status because of the dependence on the abuser. To report to the police, right? And and also they bring a mindset from their home country about the legal system and may not trust the police or the formal system outside of the family. So imagine a person who's dependent, if he or she does not call the police and does not, then what will happen to the safety? We also see a lot of our survivors say that they call from abroad and say that they have been abandoned by their abuser, and the abuser have just taken all the papers and come here, and they are not being able to now come back. So transnational abandonment then becomes an issue, right? These may be very new concepts for a few of you who are listening today, and you're welcome to, contact us to know more about what is transnational abandonment, because that will take a lot of the time. I cannot go into more details. But, these are the things that we see on top of the power control that the usual Duluth model shows are what that the survivors of color face when they are dependent on the abuser's visas. Religion can be a part of the abuse as well. Verses can be taken out of the context and used against them. There can be religious interpretation, which can be misinterpretations. So there are all this power and control that ultimately manifests into domestic violence and sexual assault. So if you go to the next slide, you see that this is why culture matters, right? So if our goal is to ensure that the victims are able to make the best decisions, for the best outcomes in their attempts to live abuse-free life. It is important to understand how the culture shapes an individual's experience of violence, whether the perpetrator accepts the responsibility, whether services are accessible, and our own biases. And so does culture matter? Of course it matters, only if you understand it, that the cultural identities are individual and complex, and sometimes they're simplified, but their assumptions can be have very serious consequences. Like if you look at a culture, a culture of immigrant, survivor who comes to you, comes from a culture of collectivism, you know, we see that we come from this culture of collectivism where we respect elders' decision. One may live in a joint family system. That can be another reason. And joint family system is where, the parents and the, and then the uncles and aunts and siblings, they all live together. Therefore, we see, also arranged marriages exist in our culture as well, because we respect elders' decision. And these are not unique. This is not only a South Asian issue. It cuts across the boundaries of races, religion, and ethnicity. And Tari has done research where it showed that 52 countries worldwide practices arranged and forced marriages. And but then, the culture is very important, because in these cultures, a divorce can be looked down upon, right? And depending on the religion, divorce can be forbidden. Like Orthodox Christians, there's no divorce. We have had a client who called us last week who said she was served with a divorce, but she does not want to file a divorce because her religion prohibits that, right? So you have to understand where the person is coming from and how to deal with that. On top of this patriarchal culture that exists, can be seen in a woman having a less position in the family, and with defined gender roles and decisions trickling down from elders, and specifically men. The honor of the community and family is often invested in the women, and therefore the burden falls on the women to uphold the honor. So yes, culture shapes how we act and we react, and these conceptions shapes the perpetrators and the community responses, to the intervention and acceptance of responsibility. Mindset of the reporting to the police is very important. It's a private matter, not to be discussed. Shame related and associated with it. If a person reports, maybe her younger sister who's back in the country may not even get married, right? Reporting against parents for forced marriage, victims can ostracize her from her own community. So culture shapes acts, and also, if you look at the services, it also shapes the access to services that might be crucial for victims and survivors for the whole family. For example, the shelter's limitation of culture-specific services, for example, food and the language, becomes a barrier. And for imagine a forced marriage survivor who's a minor. How many of you know that in your community, in your county, in your city, there is a shelter program directed for that? The culture of the system of the advocates and first responders will also impact the outcome. For example, if a person wearing hijab comes to you, and you all assume that she already comes from a abusive culture, and will not report, that can be detrimental. So our own biases also matters. Remember though, like after 9/11, when a lot of the Sikh communities were regarded as Muslims, right? And I would say that if we say it in one sentence about the importance of cultural competence I will quote Maya Angelou, who said that I can be changed by what happens to me, but I refuse to be reduced by it. So yes, culture really matters, and as we said, it cuts across the boundaries, and we are all in it. And especially to someone who is new to this country and needs to be inclusive, needs to be heard, needs to be valued. Culture really matters, and we all need to be inclusive, and we all need to have that cultural competence to help these survivors. Um, let's.
Thank you, Nusrat. That was really powerful. I appreciate you and the work that that you do and the care you take to those of us who are impacted by forced marriage, child marriage, and in this space. And though we may give examples of specific communities, I do think is very important to remember these are examples, right? This issue is not an issue that is impacting a specific population or a specific ethnicity, a group of folks. But those examples that are shared are to enhance our learning as we work with maybe those specific communities. One thing that we always like to say, especially when we're thinking about our own approach in working with victims, survivors, individuals impacted, is that we need to be really careful when we overlook in one direction because we think a problem is caused or yeah, caused, I think is a great word, caused by a particular group of folks, and then we underlook. And when we are doing that, we're over criticizing, we're leaning into judgment, and we're actually closing the door on individuals who may need our help because we don't think they are the ones who are facing this type of abuse or potentially face this type of abuse, right? And there are many reasons why someone may use marriage as a way to exert power and control. Parents who are abusive, who may be of any and all backgrounds, whether they could be, folks who have no immigrant tie whatsoever. And so it's really important to make sure that we recognize those pieces. This slide gives a little bit of a deeper dive on dynamics that we have seen in refugee communities and support and or I would say comments that we've heard from refugee service providers. And so what I'll highlight here that goes hand in hand with what Nusrat just shared is that it is we should never say your culture, is the reason this is happening to you. We're here to rescue you, we're here to help you, be, American. If you were, from the United States, this wouldn't be happening to you. We're so sorry your family treats you this way. All of those pieces are not helpful. To name these issues as traditional practices are not helpful. To name them as cultural issues are not helpful because that is not what it is, right? Forced marriage is a form of abuse that is, again, connected to other forms of violence against women that we all are familiar with. And we do need to honor the fact that the person who has reached out for support, regardless of their background, that we honor that bravery and we give them an appropriate response. Right? We don't have to know everything, but we certainly could be non-judgmental. And so let's expand a little bit on how we see this in children. So I'm going to pass it right back to you, Nusrat, to get into maybe just the cycle of abuse and how children are impacted before I keep going.
Yes, as Helis just mentioned that, that this impact can go beyond, the age limit, right? So you can be in that cycle of abuse, which is, domestic violence, as I said, is all about power and control. So if you look at this uh, uh, slide, you'll see that there's this tension building, yelling, swearing, criticizing, blaming, etc. And then it goes to the explosion period where there's outbursts. It can be physical, verbal, emotional, sexual, and then there's this honeymoon period, and it goes round and round and round. But when this happens, there may be children who are witnessing this, right? So we see that this cycle of abuse also impacts the children. And I'll just share some statistics where, the World Health Organization had done a huge study on the impact of children having witnessed the abuse and what are the consequences. And it showed nationally representing samples of children up to the 17, found that children who had witnessed intimate partner violence in the previous 12 months were 3.8% times more likely to experience maltreatment during the 12 months than children who do not witness intimate partner violence. Another study found that approximately 35% of children in the United States, and I'm going to only state the statistics from the United States because we are here, between the ages of 14 and 17 have been exposed to intimate partner violence, and that 40% of all child abuse victims report violence in the home between their parents. And although not every child who is exposed to intimate partner violence is also a victim of maltreatment or vice versa, the data from the United States suggests a spectrum of violence that cannot be easily parsed into its separate component, right? And these effects includes intergenerational transmission, in which individuals who experience violence as children subject their own children to violence either through direct means such as maltreatment or through indirect means such as exposure to intimate partner violence. And in these studies, Dr. Cruz showed how individuals who are exposed to violence during various periods in their lives may eventually expose their own children to violence, as perpetuating that cycle of abuse you're seeing on the screen. And she explains that an important point in the cycle of violence is when an individual who has experienced violence exposes his or her own children to violence, either through perpetration or through exposure to intimate partner violence. But however, she also stressed the fact that there are multiple pathways by which an individual can arrive into that point of intergenerational transmission of violence, and the factors related to violence exposure earlier in the life can play a significant role, right? So the children can also be a part of that cycle. And now Helitz will discuss what factors heightens the risk of forced marriage in children and adults.
Thank you, Nusrat. And so I'm going to, move through this section pretty quickly to ensure that we get to our screening and responding section. But I think we would not do this issue justice if we did not highlight the reality that those who are minors or under the lawful age to marry do experience some at times, greater risk because they lack the ability to seek services help on their own in many states. They also have to rely on their family for essentially everything. And so we have worked with individuals who are maybe receiving services as adults, but the trauma, the history that they have experienced, they have never received services for that, right? And if you think about just the difficulties that a young person has in navigating life and making decisions because they are not, technically, have that autonomy, it is incredibly difficult to think about how their own ability to self-help. And so I'll leave you with an example of a survivor who shared in the Survivor Story compilation about the conflicts that she had with the law once she was married as a child. She named that the police would not help her because they said that marriage was a domestic dispute when she reached out for support. When she tried to go back to school, they told her that she was too young because she actually couldn't drive, and the kids that she had weren't allowed on the school bus, and so she had to drop out. She also could not get a job because of child labor laws that limited the hours that she could work. And then she also, again, could not drive to work. And so, again, we're going back to that understanding of that great deal of power and balance. And so, if you're working with someone, it's really important to ask about, again, how the onset of their relationship came to be, because, again, before they have gotten to you, they may have experienced um, a load of harms, right, that are impacting their ability to connect with you and to move forward in the way that we may want them to, as it relates to goal setting and getting support and services and all the stressors of the shelter exit timelines, you name it. Um, and a quote from the same survivor named, the laws that were put in place to take care of children suddenly disappeared under the pretense that I was a married woman, right? And so again, thinking about the sort of helplessness that folks truly find themselves in, and even service providers when you're working with someone who is, a minor. And so this is not a presentation fully on, on child marriage in the US, but what I will share is that in the US, we do have this problem. We are part of the globe. This is not an issue that is an imported issue. This is not an issue that is brought by other folks or only happens in certain areas. Our laws allow for this type of abuse to happen and for often girls to really be trapped, often in relationships with individuals who are decades older, who are abusing them in many ways and often for many, many years. And then there is, a loss of healthcare, of education, of finances, and even their own ability to have power over their body. And at times that means the lack of access to, care for themselves and, force to engage in sexual activity and have children that again are potentially being brought in the world without any sort of consent again. So again, thinking about just abuse and being stuck in that space. The quote on the bottom is one that I find really powerful. Again, as we think about not overlooking in one community, but understanding that this issue is present across backgrounds and that families utilize forced marriage or marriage as a tool to exert their power, is that quote on the bottom of the screen, which goes, "That little girl was me, and my perfect soccer mom did not look like an abuser. No one saw her for what she was, and no one helped me." And so you'll have these slides in the recording. For those of you who may want the slides directly sent to you, happy to do that one-on-one and to offer greater technical assistance. I'm sure my colleagues can drop our email and we can do that directly for further support. But even in situations where marriage of someone who is a minor, even if that marriage is not technically, unlawful, what we know from the data is that there are still huge health and complications to girls in particular, and that they are then stuck in a cycle of abuse, of power imbalance, and victimized regularly, and find themselves as they're, growing in without support, without knowledge of resources, and often ending in other relationships that are abusive, right? So again, thinking about the work that a lot of you do and your work with adults, do you know if you're working with someone who was victimized as a child? Do you recognize that pattern of, wow, I'm working with them now, they're 21 years old, they have, multiple children, but when was it that that marriage came to be? When was it that there was that breakdown of services? Why did they drop out? Or is it that they dropped out or they weren't allowed to go to school or they couldn't? Like the example that I gave of that young woman whose abuser is like, yeah, you can go to school, but technically he had to enroll her because she was a minor. She couldn't ride the bus. She had to have multiple children and they weren't allowed in the school bus, right? And so as it's important for us to be aware of that, to truly give folks the services that they need and potentially be more lenient on certain rules and policies and the quick speed that we may need to reach goals and things of that sort. And so I would love to pass it to my coworker Bree to get into a bit of screening and responding and working with minors, and then we'll move forward. So Bree, I'll pass it to you. Please take it away.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Leeds. My name is Brianna Roberts. I am the Forced Marriage Initiative Associate. So a lot of my duties includes being the direct case manager for our program, so working with individuals who are impacted by this form of harm. And in my work, I do frequently work with minors. So getting into working with minors, it's very challenging working with them. You can go to the next slide, Leeds. Minors often have limited autonomy and they face stricter parental oversight and they might lack access to safe and private communication channels. They are very heavily monitored and controlled. So in my experience, when I'm, coordinating services for a child, I usually reach out to a trusted third party and so I usually reach out to a trusted third party who is supporting that minors. And you yourself might be considered as a trusted third party. So, some of those individuals might look like a counselor or a teacher or academic advisor. And it's someone who bridges the gap between them and supportive services. So when working with a minor, you might want to consider arranging phone calls or check-ins through that trusted adult. And this just helps reduce risk of their help seeking being discovered. When I'm working with minors, it's always, important to, explain what mandatory reporting means, what information do you have to report, how that process would look like, and what might the potential results be. So this is just, a transparent way to help them manage expectations, and it gives the minor a clear understanding of what steps they might follow. And, especially because if it's not handled correctly, it could escalate risk in the household. So, when you're working with them, you should think about like how will they remain safe at home if it's discovered that, a report was made to CPS, because they're essentially like quote unquote talking about, private family matters. So creating like a safety plan and how to remain safe at home if that does happen, and being honest and realistic. You don't want to make promises to the minors that you can't keep. Our role is to support the young person in navigating what their options are for safety, while also helping them access appropriate protection and resources. So when in doubt, you can always give somebody a resource, even if they're a minor. Their age shouldn't be, stop them from preventing like life-saving support. And, even if you're not working directly with minors, as it's been mentioned, you might be working with an individual who's a child marriage survivor or someone who might have experienced, abuse related to forced marriage as they were, a kid. And, these coercive tactics, by the family members, put an incredible amount of pressure on the minor to get married. And that sometimes often meets the definition of child abuse. So, adults who experience this form of harm, as a child, they frequently carry complex trauma history, and it often shapes how they navigate their experiences in their adulthood. So when we work with, survivors of child marriage, they often face greater challenges, trusting advocates, living independently, compared to individuals who might have been married as an adult. In many cases, they're pulled out of school early. They might not have, their bodily autonomy. They might be forced to um, you know, bear children at such a young age. And they might also be financially dependent on others as well. And so now they're struggling with being self-sufficient. So some of the individuals we work with never were allowed to have a job. Um, they couldn't make decisions on their own. And even what we might consider like easy and simple tasks to do, like riding a bus, filling out applications, or forms, they were never given that chance to do that. So it might be a little scary for them to do that. And these are all just long-term impacts of child marriage. And yeah, and it just follows individuals throughout their adulthood. I'll pass it to my colleague, Nusrat.
So Brianna had said very in a very descriptive way of how challenging it is, right? If a person is a victim of forced marriage, and if that person is a minor, even if that person is an adult, is also so challenging. If you look at this the slide, you'll see that this person has so many thing around it. It's so confusing even to look at the slide, right? There's so many people get involved as soon as that person calls that or makes that 911 call, or a neighbor makes that 911 call. So many parties get involved in that, right? And that's because American system is adversarial and very formal, and the courts here are working under a court's rule that extremely stringent, and the process is more important than just a person. And then if you look at this slide, you'll see that once the call is made, it can bring a room full of people into your life, all with good intentions, all working under the rules and process. So even after a victim escapes the abuser, the situation may be so much complicated. If you look at the slide, where there can be a counselor, if the children are involved, there can be child protective services involved, courts involved, lawyers involved, prosecutors involved. Just imagine a high-risk client called you just had this morning and assessed today, and they have lethality involved, and also that person may have a mom living with her, and that person needs a protective order. There may be a felony charge against the abuser. How can you place that person without her mom in a shelter where the shelter will not take her mom? Who wants to take, who does not know where to leave the mom. Moreover, immigrants are not aware of the legal system, and they don't understand why they would speak about the journey in front of all these strangers. Like, on top of all of this, if there is forced marriage, which is not even spoken about, imagine the individual's challenges. And even if there are shelters that you can place that forced marriage victim, if that person is a minor. Next slide, please. So at Daya, we have seen this challenge, right? Where when we did the first call, not necessarily all of them speak about forced marriage in the first call, and we were seeing that in the subsequent conversation, the forced marriage issue came up, and it all depends. It is all dependent, right? Forced marriage, sexual assault, stalking, and others that we have already discussed. So what we did in Daya is that we revised our screening tool, and we made it a mandatory one to when we are doing the assessment, when we are doing the gender assessment, when we are doing the assessments in the first call, we are also asking questions about how did that person, how about the relationship and about the marriage, and if it is forced marriage, arranged marriage, and when we started in the process in 2021, the screening, we had 10 clients, and that rose up to 80 plus yearly currently, right? So there's a way that the advocates can bring this up in your conversation, and there can be several ways of how to do that, and Brianna has spoken about it and will be speaking more, and how innovative you can be to be interactive and learn about the forced marriage situations.
Thank you, Dr. Amin, for providing that great overview. So, you know, getting on to ways to ask, if we are not asking about how someone's marriage came to be, then we are missing a critical piece of that person's trauma history. So, as someone who used to work for an anti-trafficking organization, we would often ask about a person's trafficker, which, at times was their spouse or the person that they were married to. But as I reflect on my work, um, I never saw the marriage as a form of abuse on its own, and often failed to ask, the follow-up questions about like the onset of their marriage. So the more that I do this work with survivors of forced marriage, the more that I see how interconnected all forms of abuse and crimes are. And I realized that not acknowledging the full history, the full trauma history of a person does a disservice in their healing journey. So let's talk about how to start implementing questions in your intake and assessment documents. Just being mindful about your own biases. You don't want to unintentionally cause more harm or to reinforce, harmful stereotypes, as this can really influence how you ask, who you ask, and kind of make assumptions based on their responses. Forced marriage happens right here in our own backyard, even to individuals who don't have immigration related ties. And that's why it's so important to, if you're going to ask, you ask everybody, not just who may seem like they're at risk. You don't know unless you ask. And so we included some questions that you can honestly take right now and incorporate into your intake and assessment documents. Just being mindful that if you directly ask, are you being forced into a marriage, you may not get the disclosure that you're seeking. Individuals might feel uncomfortable, or they might consider this as like private family matter, and they might not identify as being a forced marriage survivor, so they might not disclose. And instead, you might want to, use open conversational questions like, how did you meet the person that you're married to? Can you tell me a little bit more about the relationship? And then really ask questions that get to the heart of, the force, fraud, coercion. Are they being pressured? And this just allows us to get to that, part of the conversation without directly confronting them about the forced marriage that might seem a little bit intrusive. And, when we're supporting survivors of forced marriage, it's important to be curious and non-confrontational. Don't let the fear of being seen as, culturally insensitive stop you from asking the necessary questions. It's okay to acknowledge what you don't know. And, as you're working with them, start by clearly explaining your role so the survivors know, what to expect and, what to expect, what you can and can't help with. And we always want to center their voice by asking, what has been helpful in the past, what might be the most helpful right now, and always recognize that they are the experts of their own situation and experience, including how their parents might react to them trying to avoid, of course, marriage. And, if you're working with a person who has limited English proficiency, never involve family members or community members, as interpreters, even if they're from, the survivor's cultural background. It's always safer to bring in a professional third-party interpreter, and this, guarantees their safety and protects their identity. And we never want to act as a mediator between the person at risk and their family. Forced marriage involves, complex power dynamics, and mediation might be mishandled and just put the survivor at greater risk for harm. Yeah, so, as we discuss the best practices in providing support, it's always good to remember that the experience of survivors of forced marriage are not always the same. Each person's experience is unique, and their safety plan should be individualized and tailored to meet their specific needs and values and circumstances. And the way that survivors are often perceived might affect their help seeking process. Many survivors come from communities that are marginalized, or they feel like they are heavily monitored by law enforcement. And we should never pressure an individual to make a report on their situation, even if it's, well intended. In our experience, survivors are often more open to taking out protective measures against the person that they're married or forced to marry versus their family and other loved ones, even if they were, the one who were pressuring them to into an unwanted marriage. And, when a survivor does want to seek help through the legal systems, through our experience, they should never label that situation as a family matter or a cultural matter. Forced marriage is a serious harm and it should be treated as such. And that dismissal or the judgment often exacerbates the survivor's feelings of helplessness, and it could lead them to remaining in a harmful situation longer than intended. So our approach, centers the individual. And it's one where we recognize the power that we hold in our roles, our resources, our access to resources, and our knowledge of one's rights. Through these connections, we never want to gatekeep. We, want to offer support through thought partnership, educating individuals about their rights, what available options are to them, and and the healthy in non-healthy relationship, and always encourage them to, make informed decisions for themselves. And we also understand that disclosure not always means that a survivor is ready to take action on their situation. Survivors often have a lot on their minds, uh, like, what might happen to them, especially since this might be like the first time that they're on their own. They might be worrying about their younger siblings who are left at home. Some survivors have chose to remain home in order to shield a younger sibling. And there is often that social isolation from their family, from their community, that they're also considering as well. And all of that can make a person feel stuck or even change their mind about leaving. And that's completely natural and it's okay. So it's just important to be patient and to prepare for that. And, building trust and respect by offering resources and information on survivors' rights, while also recognizing that, they might be facing, other forms of systemic discrimination. We always want to approach each person without judgment. Some survivors might be seeking validation, while others might perceive, certain questions or criticism, certain questions as criticisms of their family, of their culture, and they may shut down. And it's okay to remind that person that, they can still have love for their family, they can still hold pride for their culture and their religion, but they just want these harmful practices like forced marriage to stop. And I'll pass it to my colleague, Dr. Amin.
So, Brianna, you've said everything, and I don't want to repeat it on this slide again of what you said, to be non-judgmental, to be with the client, to believe him or her, to listen, and to validate and say that it is not it is easy situation, and validate the response, asking questions which are open-ended, and also separate the ideal versus the reality. So let's this slide talks about all these challenges, right? When the clients come and they say that I want justice. So what does justice look for him or her? If they say that, hey, I was in a forced marriage situation, or my parents are wanting to forcefully marry me, can you stop them? We cannot do that, right? So what we can do, Brianna just rightfully said, what steps can be taken, how you can help that victim, survivor to navigate the system is what your role would be, right? And so I'll just give you one example of a client, Jasmine, a fictitious name. She went to a shelter with the two minor children. She was a victim of forced marriage in the home country. She came here. Totally ignorant of the system. And then she was pregnant with the third child when she was in the shelter, where she had signed a lot of the papers, not understanding what she's signing because of the language barriers and ignorance of the legal. And the case was filed, felony charges were invoked, abuser was charged, and who was later deported by ICE. And here, Jasmine lost all the confidence on the system, saying that she just wanted to end the abusive relationship, live with respect, and get the child support. And she asked me, what does the plea bargain mean? And so I had to explain it to her, told her that I got a call from the DA saying that he will be deported. And I struggled how to even bear the news to her when she was already told me that she never wanted to send the abuser to the jail, rather than to end the abuse and just leave her alone. And now she's a cancer patient, and now she's the huge toll of her taking care of the three children and the dad being absent, right? So the definition of justice differs from person to person, right? How it looks for person. So whether you want a restorative, transformative justice, or whether you want to invoke the criminal justice system, it all depends on person to person, right? And then also the expectation of the legal system here. If a person says, oh, I don't want to file a report, or I don't want to give my child to the abuser, and I want the sole custody, that is unrealistic expectations. So, how do you do that? Advocates in our, DIA, we always talk about all of this. We always have trainings, how to, address these things, how to, talk about, this unrealistic expectation and manage the expectation. So, and then remember, healing can only happen when one accepts. And, so the mental health as the primary tool of healing is very important to keep in mind. So keeping that justice space here, your role as an advocate here is to listen and validate, at the same time, talk about the reality, as Brianna just said, and I said, and in our conversation, we all said. So, making sure that the justice is maintained, you also keep on doing your advocacy, right? And that's how we can all work together and create a safe space for the survivors who we all work with. If you have any further questions, you can always reach out to us. I know this 1.5 hours is not enough. We have just run through all the slides. And you may have a lot of questions. We would love to answer them, and we would also would encourage you to come and reach to us individually if you have any other questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nusrat and Brianna and my colleagues who are on the line, as well as everyone who is here with us. Again, I encourage all of you who are on the call, who are experts, my colleagues, friends, and who do this work, feel free to utilize the chat for additional support. You're welcome to drop in the chat information to your programs, your organization. The more we share, the better, so folks get the support that they deserve. I know that we have some questions. If it's okay, I'm going to pause for a second to see if my colleague Alex, if there's any questions that you flagged for us. If not, then I know that there is a question related to Virginia that perhaps we may want to talk a bit more about. Recognizing that we are at time, this portion is still recorded, but if you're able to hold on a few more minutes for this Q&A, I would love for you all to stay on. And if you want further one-on-one support, then please do email us, and we'll be happy to do Q&A one-on-one if that is something that folks may want. So I will stop sharing screen, and Alex, if you, oh, I see that you're on. I'll pass it to you.
Yeah, thanks, Leets. There were really two questions that came up. I'll start with the Virginia one because I have a partial answer to that. So there was one question from an advocate in Virginia. If we get a call from a victim who is a minor and they are clearly in an abusive situation, but they are married, how do we handle making a report? And so I will start just with a brief note on Virginia law. So Virginia has recently banned child marriage, but because of the ways that U.S. law works, states have to generally recognize marriages that are conducted in other states. And so while it is now illegal for a minor to marry in the state of Virginia, a 17-year-old, for example, could still marry in Maryland and then, move to Virginia. Or, there are a number of other states where that marriage could still take place, and then they could be living as a married minor within the state of Virginia. And so in terms of how do they handle that report, I will pass to the service providers in the call.
Thank you so much. And Lynn, feel free to ask more, and I'm happy to chat one-on-one or happy to chat with the hotline folks in Fairfax. And so as Alex mentioned, right, we are, proud of the work that we've done in Virginia, right? We know that child marriage is fully, unlawful in Virginia. That doesn't mean that we may have a minor in the area, someone who was married in another state, and they're here and they're needing services, right? And so my work in Virginia has led me to see that married minors have received services from the local domestic violence programs. And so I would encourage you to follow the resource provisions that you typically do. I would encourage you to see us, the FMI, the Forced Marriage Initiative, as a resource as well for that married minor. And so although we're not here to fully discuss about our service work, given the training, we can always be a resource and happy to be an additional advocate for you and for that person who is needing support. And so age should not be an issue in getting someone services. And what I'll say is that it goes hand in hand, right? We get the information on how to report child abuse to the child abuse line. But what we need to utilize as well is what we know as a victim services provider, right? Reporting to child abuse is not getting that person help on their own, right? And so, yes, you may have to make a report because of what they're saying and their age, and because, marriage is unlawful in Virginia, and you may not have all the information as to how this person was married and where. And you should still give that minor the information for them to self-help, right? And that could be our program. Potentially, we could connect to legal services. I know we worked with some of the organizations who are on this call in connecting minor clients to, legal services for protection orders, for shelter services, shelter support. And so I would say, follow your protocols, and please do not see age as a barrier to giving someone contact information, right? You have numbers for hotlines, you have number for providers. I'm sure you have them as well for, like youth service providers. See us as one of those too, right? And depending on the need, then we will connect with organizations, local, maybe not local, to offer greater support. At times, that may also even mean us connecting hand on hand with the guardian ad litem that may become involved, to even, we've had connections even with the state attorney, the county attorney, to offer information on this issue directly, and to discuss best practices and ways that the local elections petition, I say local, just meaning that, well, I know what that's like here in Virginia, how that has been of support. And so thank you. Thank you for that. Again, please do connect. Happy to chat one-on-one, and happy to even do more additional training and support if that is helpful. We've done a lot with the domestic violence network in Fairfax County, but it's been a while since we've done a training directly here, and I see there's a lot of hotline folks on, so I'm happy to make those connections, or Lynn, you can help me with that. We can offer that support. Yeah. Was there any other question, Alex, that you flagged, or any other comments?
Yeah, there was one other one that came up earlier in the presentation, talking a bit about international dynamics. There was a question, how should a service provider handle a case in the situation where the person has already been forced into marriage in another country before contacting a service provider here in the US? And presumably this person is now located in the US.
Yeah. Well, I can handle that, but I know I've spoken a lot, and I'm sure, Dr. Amin, would you like to answer, or?
So it can have I don't have the whole dynamics, and I don't know about the whole situation and the facts of the case, but we do see clients who contact us after they have been brought here, and maybe on a student visa, or maybe on a visit visa, because they have been married there religiously. And when they come here, and it is a forced marriage, and it may be a forced marriage, and then when they come here, there the other dynamics starts happening, the domestic violence, sexual assault, and, in the marriage, in the relationship. And then the person gets to know that this person was earlier married, and that was not disclosed. And then what happens, right? So I don't know about this particular case, but if this type of things happen here, then, if we do help that person who's a victim of forced marriage with all the services that we give through our case management, right? But the legally, we know that it's a bigamy. You cannot just marry a second person without divorcing the first person. And so if this second person becomes dependent on the abuser's visa, and that's why the abuser never even brought that person on a spousal visa, because he has this other wife here. So the student visa, when it expires, or the visitor's visa, when it expires, that person becomes undocumented. And we do help under the VAWA, this person. So it is not that there are no avenues for legal recourse. There are, but then you have to scrutinize and see what the abuser's visa is and how you can help, whether you want to go through the U visa or the VAWA or the asylum, whatever, the assessment needs to be done. But a fact of the matter is, if one person marries twice, then that is bigamy under the USA law, because you have to have that, divorce the first wife and then marry the second wife. So then there's this plurality of law, because there's this religious marriage that happens outside of the United States.
Yeah. Nusrat, I think what you helped us emphasize is just that anything that relates to a potential immigration related concern, and I don't know if this question is leaning that way, but in general, and we just should emphasize the importance of connecting to immigration legal professionals, because the cases are incredibly complicated. Options are regularly changing, and it is really important to connect folks if you are working with someone who does have status, but they're not a U.S. citizen. Regardless if they do have status, you want them to be connected right now to an immigration attorney to better understand rights options. What does family law look like for them, for their children? What is the support that they actually can get? What are their legal rights, and how to attempt to have those rights be upheld. We have certainly worked with individuals who are U.S. citizens who do go to maybe, let's say, parents or grandparents' home country, who are forced to marry, who are also forced to stay. That's what we call, and Nusrat mentioned it, transnational abandonment, and reach out to us and again other partner orgs who are on the line for support in returning to the U.S. That is called a repatriation process, and we are very familiar with that type of help. Ultimately, regardless where someone was married, regardless, if it was a forced marriage and they are reaching out for services, for support, we should be honoring that courage to reach out for support and be non-judgmental and just go from there in what are the services, what is the support that we can provide. We could always be a resource. That doesn't mean you have to refer to us. That can mean we can chat with you one-on-one. We can give you some tools, some tips, right? If that's helpful. Maybe it's not us. Maybe you use us to connect to another organization like Daya or Sanctuary for Families who's on the call, right? Or someone else. Happy to make those connections so that you have those in your area. But again, it's just really important to make sure that we are not turning our backs on folks, because the reality is that one moment that they have called may be their only chance. And your response may determine if they are actually going to reach out again for services or move forward with what is actually safe for them. Yeah. So thank you so much for that. I don't know if there's anything else, but Alex, I will flag that we do have someone from the Family Violence Law Center in California. So just a little shout out to them, or I should, a major shout out to them. I know we're excited for the family, the FMPO, the Forced Marriage Protection Order that we hope is able to occur. Not sure if you want to say anything else, but really excited about that. So thank you for being here.
Thank you for having this conversation. It's very important. It is very important for everyone here to know, as let's just said, that please, we cannot say that everyone knows everything. We all know everything. We all have to work together to make this happen, right? To help the survivors who makes that first call. So we are here. And we can be as a resource to you, have our resources ready. And that's what the cultural competency also means, that do not work at the crisis. These conversations are important, to have the resources ready in hand, so when the survivor calls, you can connect the survivor or give this resource to the survivor. Meaning, we may not be the person, but we may know somebody else, as Heli said. So we are here, and we can do the assessment and see how these survivors can be helped. We can definitely assess that and do that. So thank you for hearing us and being here. Thank you, Helid. Thank you, Alex and Brianna.